Welcome, everybody. We are here in our second think tank, and it's great to have you all joining us. This is our Air Vehicles for Urban Air Mobility in Latin America think tank. It's really exciting because the air vehicles are that which catches the public imagination, and it's the cool toys that we all like to talk about, of course. And Despite the fact that urban air mobility actually entails a system of systems, a whole bunch of other systems operating for it to actually happen. It's definitely the air vehicles that attract our attention to most of us who are aviation enthusiasts, and it's those air vehicles that allow, in the end, urban air mobility to actually happen, and it has to do with all those enabling technologies that are appearing in the last years, and that we definitely sit on the shoulders of the drone industry in many ways, right? So I want to say hi to everybody. My name is Felipe Varon. I am the founder and CEO of Varon Vehicles, a disruptive infrastructure company. And this is a very interesting panel, not only because we're talking about the air vehicles, and that we have a group of very reputable people, each one on their specific area, but also because several of us are Latin American in origin. So that sort of gives us a bit of, let's say, authority to talk about the nature of Latin America and the culture, mobility problem in this region of the world, and so on. So I want to introduce our panelists. We have joining us Andres Stein, Head of Strategy for Embraer, Embraer's market accelerator, and is also leading its urban air mobility project, mechanical engineer, scholar in strategic marketing, and has more than 20 years experience in the aerospace industry. Adam Slepian. Adam is the global head of partnerships for Hyundai Air Mobility. In his role, Adam and his team work to develop strategic partnerships across the air mobility ecosystem in order to support Hyundai's vehicle development, advancement of supporting digital and physical infrastructure, and opening of a competitive commercial air mobility market. Simon Briceno. Dr. Simon Briceno is head of advanced air mobility at Jaunt Air Mobility and is responsible for Jaunt's operational initiatives and business development in the advanced air mobility ecosystem. Prior to joining Jaunt, he spent 15 years as a research faculty at Georgia Tech, leading research in transformative aviation. Chip Downing, Senior Marketing Development Director at Real Time Innovations, RTI, and an avionics safety certification veteran. RTI's flagship product is RTI Connect DDS, a connectivity framework now designed into over 250 autonomous vehicles. Michael Filipenko. Michaelo did his PhD in experimental particle physics and worked as a director for research and development of electric powertrains, so with Siemens Aircraft and lately with Rolls-Royce Electrical. Also joining us from the Varon Vehicles team is Mario Cruz, our head for data science. So welcome everybody. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted in the Skyscraper webpage, varonvehicles.com/skyscraper, so you can revisit this session and any other previous think tanks at any time. Attendees, you are able to submit your questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and at the end we will have an 8-minute slot in which we'll try to answer as many questions as possible between all panelists. Please note that the language of our think tank is English, but we have live interpretation both in English and Spanish, so you have to go to the interpretation button on the bottom of your screen to choose your preferred language to listen to live interpretation of this session in your language of choice. So with that said, I want to launch our think tank here, our conversation, with two points of very fundamental conversation that circle around the nature of the Latin American scenarios where urban air mobility will be implemented. And that has to do with the sizes of cities. And we were talking about this in the previous think tank, where we realized that cities like Lima, Bogota, Panama City, Medellin, and many others in the Latin American scenario are actually just 16 miles across, when cities in the United States are probably between 60 and 100-mile size urban structures. But here, those small size cities actually pose a tremendous mobility problem, and it takes a long time to go from one end to the other. In many cases, 2.5 or maybe more than 3 hours in peak hour times. So with that in mind, and also with the topography of Latin America, where you have many coastal cities like what we see in the background of Andres' screen right there, which is Rio de Janeiro. It's a sea level city, but then we have Bogota, which you can see right behind Chip's screen there, which is 2,600 meters ASL. That's 8,500 feet above sea level. So how does that range in the expected legs between vertiports and the altitudes at which we'll be operating, how does that affect the types of air vehicles that we could expect to be operating in Latin America? Let me just throw that out. Maybe I just want to start with the same order in the intro and give it over to Andre, and let's see from there who wants to take the ball. Andre.
Sure. No, absolutely. And what you're describing has been our bread and butter. You said Andre or Adam, by the way?
That's you, Andre.
Yeah. Oh, okay, perfect. It has been a bit of our bread and butter. When we have been developing aircraft for the last half century, basically, with that same type of issue. There are different markets, different cities. Bogota is a challenge for regular aircraft as well in terms of altitude, much harder to take off. Rio might be sea level, but it's really warm in the summer, so that also makes it quite a bit hard. And how we compensate for that and how we find the sweet spot for a global market. By the end of the day, when you're thinking on a new product, you need to think about the global market and not corner yourself in one or another niche. So neither can not attend. So you need to take Bogota in consideration. You need to make a vehicle that works in Bogota, but to the point where, okay, it still works in Rio or in Dubai or LA or London, with a good relation, with finding the sweet spot, adapting what you need to adapt. And normally that's what you call a Pareto. You need to cover almost everything. Like it's the last 1% that sometimes you need to go, okay, that I cannot make unless I create a very niche oriented vehicle. It doesn't seem to be the case in Latin America, since we have been looking at that market since the beginning. Being based here, it's a good reason for that. But beyond that, it is there is no silver bullet. So you need to be a vehicle that's flexible enough to work in these different cities without increasing the operational cost, which by the end of the day, it's very important here in Latin America as well as in other markets, but particularly here, to have something that's affordable. So you need to balance this performance level with affordability. It's not an easy job. It's not something that you do on day one. It's the secret sauce to it. It's to keep on pushing the envelope, keep on understanding as you mature the understanding of the operation itself, the concept of operations, as well as the characteristics of the product, the technology behind it. Keep on moving this ballpark more and more until you have a vehicle that works considerably well in all these different markets. But there is no silver bullet. There is no one vehicle that, okay, it's going to be just for Bogota, it's going to be just for Rio, it's going to be just for London. But Latin America, it's definitely one of the most interesting markets for that. As you said, we were created to look at the pain points as much as the technology, it's cool and everything. We want to solve problems. We want to create solutions and bring in options to the people. And when you see like my back here, it's nice, the Christ on top, very scenic. It's also a mountain chain in the middle of the city, which means that there are a lot of bottlenecks for the traffic. And that's exactly where we need to address.
Very cool. And with that, why don't we give it over to Adam now to give your perspective with regards to that. I mean, and I want to also point out that those shorter legs that we would expect in Latin America between vertiports, which are actually an entire magnitude lower than in the United States, instead of having to fly 50 or 60 miles to add value for mobility. In Latin America, we're looking at flying probably 6 or 8 miles between vertiports to actually add value to mobility. How do you see that impacting the types of air vehicles? how do you guys see that impacting the performance requirements of the air vehicles? Are we thinking that this would require more fully VTOL types of air vehicles? Do we want to rule out fixed wing or transitioning into winged flight? I mean, what's your perspective on the type of air vehicle right there, Adam?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and to jump on what Andre was saying, there is no silver bullet, first and foremost, but the way I kind of break it down is you have to look at the requirements, you have to look at the concept design of the vehicles that's driven by the requirements, and then at the end of the day, you also have to look at the cost and the scalability. So if you look at those kind of three buckets, the requirements could be different, like you say, Felipe, from Los Angeles to Bogota. I think those are two extremes. You know, Los Angeles is massive, sprawling urban environment. Bogota, a lot of people, but densely compact, right? And you have to weigh the requirements between a Bogota and a Los Angeles, whereas, you know, a Sao Paulo or a Rio or other places may be densely packed, but also are a little bit more sprawling than a Bogota. And you have to look at that outside of LATAM, you know, Latin America and South America, and look at it for some of the other densely populated areas that also are maybe a little bit more spread out around the world, because the requirements do drive the concept of the vehicle. Concept of the vehicle turns into the cost and the scalability. Hyundai, for example, we build cars. We build millions of cars a year. We build different variants because it's not that it's a simple thing to do, but it is simpler than doing it in aviation because of the time and speed to certification, the cost of doing it. As Andre said, you have a different variant, you add hundreds of millions of dollars potentially. So we have to look at it in that aspect. But it begs the question of how can you really make a niche vehicle for a niche market? It's going to be a lot more challenging as opposed to building maybe one or two variants for global consumption and global utilization that have maybe a different concept that take a different, you talk about fully electric versus a hybrid, and there could be different concepts for different requirements. I think one thing that is important though is the integration of not just the vehicle and the concept of the vehicle, but the technology that goes on the vehicle and the technology of how it integrates to what we'd call the UTM, the airspace, the infrastructure. Because what becomes more difficult too is if you don't have some kind of standardization interoperability across that, even globally, in terms of the technology and the requirements for the digital and physical infrastructure, and those actual ground infrastructure requirements, you lose a lot of scale, right? You lose a lot of scale in being able to make this cost effective, to get the price points down for the customers, the end users, the passengers in the future. So that's a very important aspect to look at. And to Andre's point, I think, again, no silver bullet, but as close as you can align that, whether it's a vehicle that's flying around Los Angeles or a vehicle that's flying around Bogota, incorporating the right technology to drive scale is really important, because it really comes down to kind of a cost-benefit analysis, right? And how do we make it affordable for the OEMs to manufacture, and how do we make it affordable for passengers to take a ride, right? And from our perspective, and I think I don't want to speak for everybody on the panel, but I think our goal for air mobility, again, just to put it out there, is not something for the elite, not something for the wealthy or the business traveler. It's for consumption by everybody within an urban environment to be able to take a ride. One other thing I would add on it, and hopefully this kind of answers the question, Felipe, is I think what we have to do is also look long term, right? You can't necessarily adapt the vehicles very quickly, you know, year to year, and put out a new model, right? For multiple reasons: the cost of development, and then what fleet operator is going to buy an obsolete vehicle a year later, right? Doesn't make sense. So you kind of have to look at where is the technology going to be in the future, marry that up with also where's the city going to be in the future, and what does this do for cities moving forward in the future? Does it change the dynamics? Can they spread out more and not be as densely populated, whether it's a Bogota, and I don't know the city planning for Bogota specifically, or other areas in South America, Latin America, or globally, and how does this fundamentally change the multimodal transportation system to allow for that expansion and kind of the sprawl that will be coming as cities expand by 2030, 2040, so on and so forth. So it's really a complicated problem, and trying to match up the requirements as best as possible to fit the technology.
Absolutely. I mean, it is. And you said very, very interesting points about public adoption and about systems integration into the airspace. And that's why we have Chip here. But I want to, before that, give it over to Simon so that he gives us his view on this.
Yeah, and I'll build on a little bit on what Andre and Adam, obviously they touched on many of the critical aspects of this first topic in terms of making sure that we understand what the requirements are for the different urban areas and regional areas, and not just in terms of the demographics or the topology or the geography, but the type of market, right? Whether it's air taxi, air metro, a different way of operating and interfacing with existing public transportation. So there's requirements that come from, in aircraft design, you'll have your requirements that come from your customer, your needs, your market, and that will typically drive the design of the vehicle. You'll do technology integration to leverage. In this case, we all are obviously benefiting from the use of electric propulsion technologies, one of many. And so one important point to make in that process of doing conceptual design is that, your design mission and your real mission are often quite different. And we see that quite a bit in aviation today, in large commercial transports, where you see many airlines using big 777s to go just 1,000 miles, or large A380s for very short distances. So, and then of course the hub and spoke versus the point to point. So there's a lot of strategies in aviation on how to use aircraft, and the same is going to apply for eVTOLs. And again, all the great points that Adam and Andre made about, not really, it's not efficient, and certainly from a cost standpoint, prohibitive to put out many different types of models for niche markets. So we all agree that that's really not the objective. You can, however, and just like in the commercial transport in part of aviation, you want to try to build a platform that is has a potential for growth, has a potential to satisfy as many markets. So there's certainly a market analysis process that you need to do and identify potential growth in the future for different urban areas, and develop a platform that really allows you to grow and maybe leverage it for other applications, other markets, air ambulance and the like, or cargo, freight, huge market there. And it would apply as well for expanding into cities in Latin America, where the physical requirements in terms of altitude and the like really have an impact on your design. So one last point I would make in terms of Bogota, which is obviously an interest here, the altitude is very important in terms of the performance of the aircraft. So high density altitudes, or where the air is thinner, really reduces aircraft performance. And as a result, propeller efficiency and reducing its thrust capability quite substantially the further you go up. And so, those are challenges, performance challenges that you would have to bake into the analysis, the operational analysis. It's not impossible. It's just part of that equation where, you'll have to make adjustments to your payload and range. So those are all important factors. Yeah.
Very interesting. Let's see what these sort of fundamental differences in Latin America that we see because of the size of the urban structures and the expected legs distance, right, and the ranges, and that in turn the type of airspace integration and the performance requirement from the air vehicles. How do you see that being probably an advantage or a disadvantage, Chip, from your point of view, from the systems integration part and the airspace integration aspect?
Yes, so I think we may have to limit the vehicles, say, around Bogota to be smaller vehicles, so they're lighter, so that will address the density challenge. I think because of the volumes in this industry, we're going to have a wide range of vehicles. It'll be a very competitive environment. And if you think about military and even commercial aerospace, military has very mission-specific vehicles that they have developed in relatively low volumes. Certainly, we're not going to build a 737 or A320 for this industry that makes thousands of vehicles. But I see a very rich ecosystem of vehicles addressing whether it's emergency services or freight or passenger carrying environments. So I think that's really key, that we're not going to just do Colombia. We're going to do the world over time. And so that this market will mature. And I think we're going to pave the way in Colombia to show them how you can make different types of air vehicles work around these different cities, and then have a air traffic communication system that actually manages those vehicles very well.
Perfect, excellent, that's good. Mikhailo, I wanted to go over to you. I mean, you, from your very technical, in-depth point of view there regarding electric vehicles and electric flight and VTOLs, how do you see, and I want to throw another point out there, which is wind conditions, right? When you have cities like Bogota, which have sort of predictable wind conditions and quite mild, but then again, you have cities like Cartagena or Panama City, which are coastal cities in Latin America, which have, of course, much better expected performance in propellers because it's at sea level, but wind conditions are way, way stronger. And how do you see that affecting the requirements or affecting the performance of VTOLs in electric ones, especially?
Right. So considering this point of wind conditions, if we think like a little bit further, not only about Colombia, but also like, let's say they've been flying in Singapore, right? They've been flying in like Shanghai, or also in the future, you want to fly in San Francisco, you want to fly in LA. So also in cities, which I think have a little bit harsher wind conditions than maybe Cartagena, certainly it will impact on the structural design. Certainly it will impact also how you have to build the propellers and motors. But I think landing under harsh wind condition is nothing new to the aviation industry, right? I mean, there are a lot of videos on YouTube where you can see pilots doing like amazing landings under the most crazy wind conditions that you can imagine. So I think this is doable. We will have to consider this, add a little bit structure weight, right, to the airplane to deal with all the requirements given by the performance envelope that we have to find, but is definitely nothing undoable. I would like also to comment on this point. Do we need a lot of vehicles? Do we need a low number of vehicles? Like now we look at the, let's say, conventional industry, right? So as Simon said, what is happening a lot, we built an A320, which is designed for 2,500 nautical miles, but most people or most airlines can use it, let's say, for 600 miles, 700 miles, 800 miles. Let's say like Ryanair. Why? Because it's operation cost, right? They are a cheap airline. They want to dump the operation cost as low as possible, so they go just for one type of aircraft. And I think concerning urban air mobility, and especially the electric and hydroelectric system, this really allows us to build like a flexible kind of platform, right? We can like have one type of vehicle, but that can actually then be optimized because of its drivetrain to different things. Like, okay, we can have a multicopter that has a battery, which then serves more for something like Bogota, where you have short distances, or we can replace the battery, let's say, with a fuel cell system or with a hydrogen turbine, and then the same vehicle could also serve for longer ranges, let's say, as a regional kind of transportation.
Excellent. So before we jump into that, which is part of the conversation today, which is the energy source, and of course it impacts, like you will say, the performance and eventually the economics, right, of the system. I wanted to throw out what you guys feel regarding the use of wings or transitioning into wings when we have such short legs between vertiports, and how does that also affect the altitude above ground that we're going to be expecting to fly at? Anybody want to jump onto that one?
Yeah, I can jump into the wind. One interesting, the wind will affect two main variables. One, if you get a headwind, that your equivalent distance would be longer, right? So the point about smaller distance, shorter distance, and a lot of seats here that are denser, and I didn't mention in other places as well. Asia does, particularly Southeast Asia, does have similar characteristics to South America as well. The headwinds kind of counterbalance that because I'm gonna need to have a slightly longer equivalent distance because of the winds. But the other point, it's as Michael mentioned, the landing and the flight riding qualities in general. If you are flying over the city, you might be, most people are afraid of flying. I mean, all of us are aerospace geeks, we love flying, we love everything that flies, but most people don't behave like that. So having certainty that you have a smooth ride, for example, helps a lot. Helps to have a safe landing and takeoff, but helps also to bring the passenger on board. And things like optimizing the fly-by-wire for that helps. So getting that understanding and bringing these different generations of fly-by-wire to the point, okay, I can make it smoother, acting and reacting faster than a human can with a proper closed-loop fly-by-wire. That they couldn't do that does help a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that there's wind conditions, it consumes power from electric vehicles, and it means a lot for the economics of the system, because if you're doing longer equivalent distances because of wind, and then eventually that's going to wear the battery charge out faster, of course. So anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would jump in real quick and to answer the wing versus no wing. I think that those are configuration decisions that are made on the aircraft. Again, are driven by the use case and what is the most optimum design for a set of different mission profiles. So I would not necessarily focus too much on 6 or 8 mile range as being the main target. It's a combination of factors. You can have a aircraft that has a 50-mile range and use it for 8 miles. The wing is clearly an enormous benefit in cruise. It's the most efficient way to cruise, and a helicopter is sort of your sort of go-to, most efficient hover aircraft. So a combination of those two is usually the best for these types of operations. The important thing to remember is that you have to take in all the requirements and ensure that your aircraft is controllable throughout the entire mission profile. One key thing with helicopters is that you move, if you've ever been in one or in low altitude flying in general aviation, there's a lot of movement, and passengers may not be used to that type of movement. And so a design that is able to maximize the controllability throughout its entire mission profile is really important here to ensure people, enjoy the ride, feel comfortable and safe. But those would be key drivers to the configuration or the choice of your design.
Felipe, if I could add, there's some fantastic points from Andre and Simon. And to add on to it is, beyond the customer experience, we're going to be asking a bunch of customers that have never set foot in an air machine ever to do this. And that comfort is incredibly important. And one of the things that we're working on. The other thing I would add on to it is, if you look at just kind of the economics of it, and back to what Simon was saying, the use case, right? Yeah. So maybe you make a vehicle that's capable of an average, let's say 30-mile trip, or a 6-mile trip. The speed that it can go is actually really, really important, right? So even if it is a 2-mile trip at, let's say, 70 miles an hour, if it's a 2-mile trip at 140 miles an hour, it's twice as fast. And if you're looking at it from an urban metro perspective, right, the turnaround time that you get with using the same, you could basically do twice as much with the same vehicle potentially, right? So it begs the question in terms of scalability, back to that, kind of where we started is, do you need a separate vehicle for that? Or can you use the same vehicle for essentially the same mission, but just a shorter range? And then does that, in the end of the day, the economic value, does that lower the cost to the actual consumer at the end to be able to get more people in the aircraft and flying? So it's a balancing act, but it's a really good question.
Yeah, absolutely. The main idea is that the urban air mobility systems are going to require many dozens, probably hundreds. Some people even talk about higher numbers of air vehicles operating at a given infrastructure network. And that means that these vehicles are going to be circling around, and by all means, having a long range, hundreds of miles range, is always positive for operations, because you simply do more flights with the same amount of energy. Let's just leave it like that for now. But let's say with the same charge or the same fuel tank. You've touched, and I think Adam was touching this point before, and this is our next topic for conversation, which is public adoption. And before I go there, I want to remind our attendees that you guys are able to submit your questions through the questions and answers button that you see on the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer the questions at the end. We have an 8-minute slot for that. We already have some good questions coming in. So please do submit your question, guys. So going to the next point of conversation, let's go to a fundamental question again. It's the fact of whether or not we want to have an operator on board the air vehicle. Now let's remember that one thing is to have a pilot, which we're referring to a traditional aircraft pilot with that word. Maybe it's not going to be that type of pilot. Maybe it's going to be a different type of operator, because the nature of these vehicles allow much less stringent requirements on that operator. So let's call it our operator for now. Do we see the air vehicles having an operator on board, or do we see our vehicles not having an operator on board? And it was David Russell's question here about it. If not, when do we see these autonomous, or let's call it pilotless flights operations happening? Maybe we want to dig into all the details that entails, which are pretty deep, but who wants to jump in? Maybe I want to give it over to Chip. What's your view on that?
So I think it's really interesting. I think for the initial flights, because a lot of people have not flown in an aircraft ever, you're going to need to have someone on that aircraft. They're not going to be piloting. They're just going to be in the aircraft. And it's almost like an ambassador. It's really the tip of the spear of this whole idea is, how do you get public acceptance? So this person has to be very well qualified, possibly with the military service. So they're really the safety and security and customer experience ambassador. And so I think it's very important to take a look at this and make sure we have people there. Now, at some point, I think you'll be able to call up a UAM and say whether you want an ambassador or not. That'll be your choice. And I think you have those types of choices today with Uber, Lyft, and other services. So I think that'll be a customer choice at some point. I think the first flights are always going to need to have someone on board just to make sure everybody understands the operation and understands the safety procedures related to the aircraft.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then eventually we'll move into probably more automated types of flight, and maybe even pilotless or air vehicle operations. But the question is when, and how does that balance out with the economics, right? Because that's payload. Michaelo, what do you have thoughts on this?
I would like to add something to that. So some month ago, there was a really nice punchline in an article, and the guy basically said, you know, we will see flying cars much earlier than autonomous cars. And the idea basically behind that, the whole article was that autonomous flying is basically a mission control problem. So it's really a technical problem. You know, you get a bunch of engineers, some substantial funding, and they can solve it. Like autonomous driving, on the other hand, it involves really a lot of ethics, a lot of, you know, things that go beyond the pure technical problem. And so now, if you look at the air vehicles that are right there right now, and look at how we fly airplanes today, right? Most of the flight is already autonomous. So like from a technical point of view, there are things to do, there are obviously things to do, but it's a solvable problem within a reasonable range of time. And if you look at the progress of a lot of companies, like flying autonomous in a simulator, which comes really close to what you can get in reality, is like fully working, and more and more companies like now working out to go from the simulator actually into the aircraft. Another point is, I think Chip made a really good point, is that the guy in the aircraft is less needed to actually fly the thing, but make the people comfortable, right? I think also the usual airlines would really love to, you know, kick out one of the pilots to save a lot of costs on the operations, but they cannot because people would feel really weird. Nobody's flying us. So I think if you think you have 4 people flying and then have one operator, so on the long term to bring costs down, to save this 25% extra will really be an important goal to go. And to conclude this is going to be like more a task of acceptance. How long do I need to have this operator on board, and like step by step reducing his obligations and flying, and more into, let's say, entertaining the people and feel them safe on the aircraft, so that people accept at some point, like maybe people did with the metro. The metro also at some point lost its driver in many cities, like for instance in London, so that people get comfortable to say, okay, I accept that the machine that has learned to do this is way more reliable than a pilot that could make him, let's say, like get a heart attack or make a mistake at any time.
So
Exactly. And I went before that, Simon, to add, I want to give it over to you, but before that, I want to throw out, how do we approach regulators with the operator on board or not?
Yeah, I'll make a couple points and maybe try to answer that one as well. First, I think Michaela and Chip, made great points about the economics for sure of removing the pilot. There's no doubt that's the direction we all want to go. And I also want to just add that looking at the automotive industry with self-driving cars, and that progress, they're a little bit ahead, but more importantly, not from a technology standpoint, but from a public reaction standpoint to that. It's another sort of example of where, we have a technology, essentially an autonomy technology that is, taking control over something that is obviously potentially very dangerous, like driving a car. So it'll just be interesting how the public adopts that technology, and then how it might translate to aviation. I wanted to make a point about autonomy versus automation, and that's important. We see an automation quite a lot in aviation today. There's a lot of pilot functions that are currently very automated, and have been over the last few decades growing substantially in that direction from navigation or systems management standpoint. And then there's some that are still not as automated, where you really need a human being, whether it's communication or going through emergency procedures, detect and avoid. All those are really important to have a human right now doing, performing those functions. And when we talk about autonomy is really about decision making. And what you're doing is you're taking the decisions out of the pilot and giving it to a software, to the aircraft, And so that's where we have that really big step change. So you can get very, very automated to a point where the operator is really monitoring the system and only takes over in emergency cases, to where you allow the aircraft to make decisions in emergency situations as well. So the question was asked about when we might see this. The good news is autonomy is being heavily developed today. As we all know, we see that a lot through drones, and we're learning a lot. We probably won't see autonomy in eVTOLs for at least another decade, or even a little bit more than that, maybe 15 years. And that's for many reasons. And to the last point there, certification. It's all about trust, and we have to obviously demonstrate through a lot of testing and ultimately through certification that we are able to trust in a whole host of scenarios the algorithms and the technologies that will be making the decisions on their own.
Great. Any of you guys want to throw in something on that?
If I might add, I think one thing we all have in common as well, it's keep on increasing the safety level of the industry as a whole. Flying, it's the safest way to travel. We're gonna keep that way, right? But the economy of scale that you're gonna need for urban air mobility to really take off, no pun intended here, it's really related to autonomous. The way you see, and I think from what I heard, everybody's kind of on the same page, and that's related to regulatory environment as well, that we see it starting as a pilot operation with a lot of the capability for autonomous flying on board already. So we can start adding data points and working from day one with the regulatory authorities to prove that the potential autonomous operation is as safe as, or even safer than having a pilot or operator on board. So I think that's the approach you believe in, both from the vehicle side as well as from the traffic management side, that will converge to that eventually, but potentially going to need to start with a pilot on board to build up the data, understand the operation. One good thing about urban air mobility, by the way, it is a very structured operation. It's very different than having an autonomous vehicle that can go anywhere, even like a car, right? You don't know what's going, could go anywhere. A drunken guy can cross in front of you. That does not happen in urban air mobility. It's a very controlled area. It's not it's not landing in the middle of nowhere. You can have the beacon, you can have all the infrastructure you need in conjunction with the vehicle.
Perfect. So let's jump to the next point. I mean, unless anybody else, Adam, or
just one more comment, Felipe, if you have time. I think it's we have to make sure we position these vehicles correctly. There's people that look at drones, and they're like out of control drones. They don't want any type of systems management. They want to fly in their own airspace, down low, very minimal management around those drones, besides making sure they don't fly in a no-fly area. This is going to be, and that's like part 107 for the FAA. This is going to be more like part 135. It's going to be passenger carrying aircraft with pilots. And we have to make that distinction as an industry, that we're not the unsafe, uncertified drones. We're the certified drones, and we're going to do that certification just like we do with passenger aircraft. And the companies that are represented here all have expertise in doing that at the highest levels, which is for software, it's DO 178C, DAL-A. And I think that's important that we make that difference and then use that difference to accelerate the use of autonomy, because that accelerates the use of efficiency as soon as possible. And
I think that point, Chip, goes towards Norman Owen's question, which is that if starting with a simple mission, can we create an economically feasible mobility system and then transitioning to fully autonomous within some 5 years? What do we think there, any of you guys?
I guess in terms of 5 years, I guess it depends on when the clock starts on that 5 years. I agree with everything that Simon was saying and Andre was saying on, it starts piloted or operated and then it moves to autonomy. I think the technology will be there and to allow that to be enabled before it gets certified. Well, obviously before it gets certified, but it'll be there well before, and we'll have to prove. I think the word that Simon used was trust is perfect, right? Because it's all about safety when it comes to this. Obviously, the economics lead to it. I think one point that I would say, though, on it that Andre hit on, which is really, really important, there's the ability to have the vehicles have automation and autonomy, but it's the integration with the airspace management, or the UTM, whatever you want to call it, that's going to be absolutely imperative. Because if this goes fully, it does go fully automated, right? You take the pilots out of it, you take people on the ground out of it as well. How does it communicate? And how does it communicate not only with a Hyundai vehicle, but with a Jaunt vehicle and an Embraer vehicle and every other vehicle, and that some kind of common operating backbone to allow that to happen, and probably truly global too, right? Because that's a technology piece that needs to be on the vehicles, and it needs to be kind of limited for scalability purposes of the differentiation there. So I think that's just a really key point in developing the automation, and especially because at the scale that we want to have these flying around. Just a really key point that Andre brought up. Just wanted to hone in on.
And you touch up exactly the point I was about to make about that's exactly where we need to collaborate, different players in the industry, not only the different stakeholders, but even between the OEMs. No one, and not sure how old you guys are, but for ones that remember the Betamax, no one wants to end up with a Betamax, great technology that no one else uses. So we need to make sure we work together to co-create that, to move towards the same direction if we want to speed that up.
A Hyundai vehicle, an Embraer vehicle, a Jaunt vehicle need to be able to fly through the same airspace and be able to talk to each other. And it can't come, and it needs to be talking to each other before it's detect and avoid. That needs to be the kind of the last case scenario of, you know, collision avoidance or emergency avoidance. It needs to be, you know, automated before it gets to that. So that is, you know, that's the last case that happens.
And I think that goes to Sergio Secuta's question, which is, shouldn't we think about a tailored vehicle design to a different set of certification rules and environment regulations? And he's referring to probably a Latin American scenario. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Instead of having a global type of air vehicle, something very specific for an emerging market.
I think goes back to the point of economy of scale, which is important for emerging market. But there are things that I think can be done. For example, regular aircraft, non-electrical aircraft, there is no change on energy density on fuel throughout the years, right? With battery, that will happen. So the fact that, okay, an early battery might not be good enough for a city like LA that like to cover everything, but might be good enough for a smaller market. Or it's the concept a bit of the MVP, the minimum viable product. So yeah, the minimum viable product, both for the vehicle and the operation, might happen in the most unlikely places. And there are some good cases for that. One thing that we see is that infrastructure, the ground infrastructure, it is an issue in general lines in Latin America, for example, right? It's not like you have subways going everywhere in every single city, that there is no other choice. So and what happened with cell phones in a lot of countries here, including Brazil, was exactly that people skipped landline altogether and went straight to cell phones. So we might see some of that happening with air mobility. We might skip some of the stepping stones for urban transportation and go straight to urban air mobility to require less infrastructure.
Great, that's fantastic. Let me throw out another point that is really interesting for this panel, which is the source of the energy, right? We want to, of course, tackle the environmental problem when proposing new mobility modes, when 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions comes from mobility, right? From land vehicles and automobiles, et.cetera. So what do we consider when it comes to fuels or energy sources in general? Are we considering fuels such as jet fuel? Are we talking about that we want to definitely go electric from the start? We have the hybrid electric alternatives, which are very attractive. What do we see there? And probably Michaelo can tell us his view from the technical perspective.
Right. Thank you for this question. I think it's a very important and interesting one, because now if you compare, for instance, an eVTOL, right, and the energy that you need to make the same trip with an eVTOL, and then say to a conventional car, maybe it's, well, maybe 40%, right? Because the conventional car is like super inefficient, especially if you use it like in Colombia, we go hills up and down. But now if you compare the energy that you need for a trip with an electric car to an eVTOL, like, I don't know, 10 times more, something in that range. So then if you want really to think about eVTOLs as a regular way of commute, regular way to go, that's a really important question to ask: where will the energy come from? And here you run into two issues. The first one is, okay, the efficiency and the generation capability of the system, which is one issue. And then the other issue is, right, how do we get the energy so energy dense that we can take it on board? So from a point of view of having the thing like energy dense, and so you can store enough energy on board, probably hydrogen, like it is pushed, for instance, right now in the European Union, is an interesting way to go. And now if you look in designs with fuel cells and so on, you see that they allow a higher range and let's say a more standardized vehicle that could be used for a lot of different scenarios. The disadvantage of hydrogen, on the other hand, is like that you need a lot more primary energy to produce it, so that you have to enhance the capabilities in your country to basically produce all that hydrogen. Like, to conclude this concerning Colombia, I think in Colombia you have like a really good head start, where like 70% of the energy is already coming from renewable sources, which is, let's say, much more than, for instance, in US. So here the primary energy could be a really nice head start for the UAM system. So you don't have to say, look guys, you know, the primary energy source is not really nice, so like this whole thing is not sustainable, but you can really say, okay, let's enhance like the hydropower that you already have. So right from the start, the energy and the system can be sustainable.
So, yeah, I was just going to add to that. That's great, Michaelo. I think, you know, the key thing, in my opinion, with energy has to do with the infrastructure, and I think Michaelo touched on that, and both sort of the demand and supply, the supply of where how you're producing the electricity is really important, and will clearly vary across countries and within countries. And so that's an important part of the equation to, you know, from an operational standpoint, you know, how you're getting the energy to your various vertiports or various places where you're charging your vehicles. So that discussion, you know, is critical to this because it involves a grid infrastructure and the sources of, you know, whether it's renewables or not. On the vehicle side, the technology, you know, and Michaelo touched on many key points of the trades between different types of energy storage, whether it's fuels or like fuel cells, hydrogen, or conventional batteries, you know, lithium ion, and then the progression of batteries as well. And so what this really adds is an interesting dimension to the aircraft design that we are all, in many cases, we're going through, because we have to account for the growth and the positive growth and potential in energy density and the use of other types of fuels on an existing platform. You know, how do you retrofit 20 years from now an eVTOL that was using batteries to use hydrogen and fuel cells? So there's an interesting a variable there that plays into the growth potential of our aircraft. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to range and not range, but energy management, which is driven by your energy, you know, how you're carrying your energy on board. And it could give you extra range, extra payload. You know, it could give you many things in your mission. And again, that touches then on the market opportunities that exist. So energy is a key discussion point, both the technology, but also the production.
It's a great point that Sabe makes. It's a balancing act between growth and upgrades and obsolescence, right? And it really comes into the actual concept design of the vehicle. If you look at current technology of today in 2020, the battery technology is not there to provide you the output that it needs to be for a specific concept 5, 6, 10, 15 years from now, right? And you have to kind of balance that between what you design in terms of your concept to meet the mission requirements, even if potentially you're giving a little bit up, knowing that 2 years later, that technology is going to be there, that you can cost effectively upgrade the existing vehicle and that concept design to then get the full max potential out of it with the technology that's there a few years later. So it's a really interesting balancing act that goes into not only the type of energy management system you have, but the actual concept design and the capabilities of the vehicle at point X and then point Y and Z potentially down the road.
Perfect. So given the time constraints here, because this is such a short time and such a tremendously large subject that we are addressing here, a number of points, I want to go over to the questions that we have remaining from our attendees. So we have a few that have already been answered already, but Mario, would you like to go over the ones that we have on the table still?
Yeah, sure. So we have 2 on the Q&A, which are left on, but I want to start with one that was sent first over the chat. This one was by Michael Syracuse. The question is, will the panel agree that communication, navigation, and surveillance are critical to scale?
Anybody?
Absolutely. I think that's something I believe Adam brought up earlier about the interfacing with, you know, the air traffic management of the future. So that involves communication, navigation technologies. The more we streamline those functions and activities in the airspace and make it such that you can safely perform operations at close distances and low altitude, the more you're going to be able to introduce more aircraft, and so they absolutely have to scale.
Let me give a real example from a city in Latin America. São Paulo has one of the largest helicopter fleets in the world, and the actual number of flights is limited because of restrictions on air traffic management. Cannot have more than 6 in a certain downtown area. So yeah, absolutely. That's one of the bottlenecks in the infrastructure that needs to be covered. We actually have one company, part of the group called ATAC, that does a lot of integration for that traffic management in Brazil. We have a project specifically on that, on Uber air traffic management. So yeah, I'm shaking my head vigorously. Yeah, we need to solve that to scale.
And I think we have to all agree that this is going to be a very data-rich environment where we have lots of data, far more than we have in commercial aircraft. There's not going to be a tower that's controlling the flights from the different vertiports. This is all going to be really autonomously managed. And there's going to be both ground communications, different sensor on the vehicle communications. There's going to be sensors at the vertiports. There'll be sharing of information in flight en route. So as you get in, especially if you get into high wind conditions, someone else is going to already have the intelligence on how to land in that wind condition. And they can pass on that intelligence to the other vehicles coming into that vertiport.
I just want to quickly add another wrench in there, which is cybersecurity. As a result of that data exchange, the safety of exchanging that data, is critical as well to be able to make sure you're getting clean information back and forth. So important.
Yeah, that's why our company has got not only got a data framework, but also a security model that layers on top of that, so you can secure data in motion.
We have a final question, Mario, there before our time is up.
Yes, so there's another question by Matt Scacero. We are seeing a lot of activity in UAM, AAM around the world, and the focus is on large aircraft for obvious reasons. Meanwhile, most of the commercial and research activity around the world is still on small UAS, less than 55. Those of us with capability in the larger than small UAS area are not seeing a demand signal to accomplish more advanced research in an evolutionary way, crawl, walk, run approach between the SUAS and these large UAM aircraft, small UAS. Thoughts on the need to accomplish research in that in-between classification of aircraft? So
anybody wants to give a short answer to that one? Our time is really running up, unfortunately.
Matt just added, as companies, do you feel this is a pay-to-play environment? Pay-to-play environment you have to be in now to be in later? Just send that. He added it.
Let me try to give it. I'm not sure if I got the question right, but if understood right, it's shouldn't we, rather than focus on larger vehicles, focus on unmanned systems? Mm-hmm. I think things run in parallel. I agree with the run, run. Yeah, thanks. Crawl, walk, run. Thanks for that. I absolutely agree with the philosophy. But they are in parallel because there will be different things for each area. We are coming as well from even larger. I was hearing you say larger vehicles, but you're looking at small urban air mobility vehicles exactly because we cannot do like electric 100-seater aircraft. So we're looking at smaller, but we are learning from even smaller things, and it needs to be in parallel. Example of that, we have a collaboration with drone manufacturer in the US that's developing cargo drones called Elroy. So we learn, and they can learn from us as well. We can collaborate on that. So, and we cannot wait. It's not a serial thing. That's what I think I'm trying to say. We need to look at the different aspects because there will be some very specific key points on each one of these different markets. We are talking about people transportation. So when you're looking on UAS, you don't need to worry about that. The control laws that go inside the vehicle that carries people are completely different than what goes in a drone. So we need to evolve and understand that really well. It's got to be all in parallel.
Well, anybody wants to give any closing thoughts before we close this think tank, which is very interesting, but unfortunately time is really short, guys. Anybody Any closing short statements?
I would just say one thing is, and it came up multiple times today, is the collaboration with industry to be able to open this actual industry, I think is going to be really important. And it came up multiple times within the conversation today. And sure, at the end of the day, it's a competitive market. It's a competitive marketplace for the vehicles and different aspects of it. But we, in our position here at Hyundai, really think that it's going to be important to work across industry with partners to be able to get this done and make this a reality over the next several years. Just really important, and everybody's working towards the same goal of making this a reality and providing that societal and economic benefits to cities around the world, South America and beyond. Right, really exciting. And thanks for having us on, Felipe. Great conversation.
Cool. Anybody else?
Just agree with Adam. Thank you again for the opportunity. You've raised many great points that we have to continue to have dialogue on. It's highly integrated, as Adam pointed out. So looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, cool. Absolutely. Same here. Really appreciate the invitation. Thanks so much for organizing it. It's always great to have the chance to share, but to hear as well, learn a bit. Looking forward for the next one.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Philip, for the session. It was great to, to share the opinions and to hear all the interesting insights from everybody else who's working on this. And I'd like to say, I think this is like a great time now, because if you remember, the automobility industry was like 200 companies and then it consolidated to 12, and now we're seeing the same. So it's still at the time where more and more companies are popping up. So we still have a lot of ideas that we can explore.
Great.
I certainly look forward to working with everybody here. I think as a team, we can make this thing a reality in a very short time frame.
That's great. And I appreciate that, guys, because that's exactly what we're doing about our vehicles. We're leading this ecosystem. We have a place in the world, which is Latin America, where many things are yet to be built. And definitely mobility is one of those things. And with that, I want to close by saying that air vehicles are definitely the enabling part of urban air mobility that is allowing us to think about systems that now can, for the first time probably ever, service actual people and the masses eventually, hopefully, as we all said during this conversation, that we can reach and solve people's problems, solve real city problems. And it means mobility infrastructure, it means city growth, with urban air mobility. So that is being able to be done because of the development of air vehicles from companies like yours. And these very new generation types of air vehicles are going to make it happen in the very near term, hopefully. So with that, I want to close and invite you to our next think tank, which is on the 11th of September. It's going to be about vertiports. And with that, I want to give you guys a great cheers and say goodbye to everybody. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Obrigado. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Спасибо большое.